Well, today, as we've been working through some of the different industries, we would inevitably fall on architecture. One, because it seems to be some of the class's favorites over the years, and I also think it's one of the more high profile. Right? It's things that we can't help but see, and especially when we see a building that stands out, I think it's definitely a centerpiece in skylines and in neighborhoods and things like that. So we are very lucky that we were able to convince Mr. Garza, who had two sons?
No, one son and one daughter.
And one daughter, okay. So we have a parent of an alum, but Robert Garza is an architect. He works for a firm and he has a lot of experience building in Dallas and offers his experience today for us. So thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
We want to start by maybe even going backwards and telling us a little bit about where you got your first inspiration to pursue a career in architecture.
So, I mean, it's kind of a funny story. A lot of times people talk to architects about where they first got their inspiration or thought about becoming an architect or thought maybe that was a direction they wanted to take. And I don't know if you all are old enough, but when I was in junior high, they used to send these counselors out to the junior highs who would talk to all the students and then talk about what potential job interests students may want to pursue as they get older and go into high school and then beyond. And there was always talks about, a doctor, a lawyer, a policeman, and a fireman. And those seem to be the dominant four categories. And so we went home, and I have a twin brother who's one of my partners here in the office. And one day we went home after that, and we were talking to our dad, and he says, well, what do you find interesting? And obviously at that point in my life, there were two things that interested both of us. We had several chemistry sets, so we thought we were really interested in chemistry, doing experiments and things like that. And then the second thing is I loved art. As a matter of fact, at that point in time, I was always drawing and doing things, trying to mimic other artists. And then as a kid, entering, art contests just to see, how they would do and stuff. And so we told them that we were interested in that. And then we referenced, believe it or not, and again, I don't know if you're old enough, but we referenced Mr. Brady. And we thought what he did was really cool, right? And it had something to do with art. And specifically, it's really funny, specifically when he worked with Zsa Zsa Gabor and he designed the cream puff building. And we were like, wow, that is really cool. And he's doing that for a living. So we told our dad, he said, well, a good place to start is when you get to 10th grade, because 9th grade was technically junior high at that time. So 10th grade was officially high school. So when we moved on to high school, he said, look and see if they have drafting courses there. And that will give you an introduction to what it is so that you can actually see if it's something you want to pursue. And oddly enough, we started drafting in classes in 10th grade, took it every year in high school, and then and obviously made the decision to go on to college and go into architecture. And so it actually was very good advice on our father's part, and it was a good experience to at least get some experience under our belt before we actually went off to college on the drafting side. At the time, there were no such things as computer-aided drafting. It was all by hand. So we got to learn the old man's profession. Anyway, so that's kind of how we got started, and we pursued it. Both my twin brother and I pursued it as well. And believe it or not, one of our friends in high school who actually took drafting classes as well because he was interested in going into architecture. Well, we all went to undergraduate school together. And as a matter of fact, he moved on to Arizona and New Mexico. He got his graduate degree at Arizona, but then worked in New Mexico and then Arizona for 25 years. And going on about 8 years ago, he was working for the largest A&E firm in the world. And they were laying off because of a recession. And so he called us up and we jumped at it and said, well, if you're going to move back here, why don't you come and work here? And so he's actually here now. And has been for the last 8 years. So it's really been kind of a fun experience.
That's great. So having been in this world for a while, what would you say are the characteristics of people who are very creative and seem to adapt well to architecture? What are they naturally good at, or what have they found a way to build those skills?
So, creativity comes in many different forms. And, if I had to break it down into two basic forms, there are those who come into this field and are naturally gifted at expressing themselves or expressing an idea. And they're very creative at that initial concept of an idea. And that's one form and talent that I see a lot of people have, and they can very quickly take out a piece of paper and put it together to convey an idea. It doesn't necessarily have to have all of the detail, it's just a concept. And then there's the other side who want to take that idea and they have a natural gift for breaking it down into components and making the detail so that that idea can actually be successful. And so in architecture, those are the dominant two types. Today, because, once you get into the role of principal, then, yes, you're managing projects and you're overseeing the production of projects and even the creative side. But one thing that they've never taught in school, be it even the early drafting courses, is the marketing aspect. And the fact that it doesn't matter what you're doing, you have to be able to sell it, And so I remember for several years when we decided to go into our own business, the marketing aspect of it. I mean, and I think architects are notorious for being horrible marketers in general, and there are a handful of architects, and Frank Lloyd Wright was one of them, who is the world's best marketer, but he was also a very creative individual. And yet, a lot of the buildings that are legacy buildings today that he designed over the years have had many issues, that had to be corrected over time with other architects coming into play and figuring out how to resolve the issues that were created when he was trying to be creative. And, his famous line, most of his buildings leaked, all the roofs leaked. And he always said if a roof didn't leak, the architect wasn't being creative enough. That was his thought process. And one of his famous clients called him up one day and said, "Hey, Frank, there is water leaking on my desk." And he said, "Move your desk." That was his reply. But back then, the architect was also very much an engineer as well. And there was no such thing as today. There's manufacturers for everything who have tested products, who have tested assemblies, who recommend how these things go together. Well, back then he was having to invent how things got put together, and so that's a little bit different than it is today, where we're actually looking up products that will work for the applications that we're trying to achieve. So it's a little bit different.
So I think this is a great segue into talking to us a little bit about from beginning to end some project. What does that involve?
Yeah, so typically, and really, it doesn't really matter if it's a municipal project or someone's residence, right? Let's say, for example, when we were working on the Highland Park Town Hall, they had a building that was originally constructed in 1923. It was a Spanish colonial style building, and the Highland Park Town Hall Council basically grew up in Highland Park. So to them, they saw this as an extended home for them. And so not only did they need, because the building looked beautiful on the outside, but on the inside, it was a mess. It had 6 different levels, because over time they did additions and renovations, and parts of the building kept the aesthetic, parts didn't. And depending on who they use as the architect with their own ideas coming in, they thought, well, maybe this would be a better direction. And so when we got into that building, obviously the first step is on municipal projects, we have to respond to RFQs, which is requests for qualifications. And so when we respond to those, we put together best examples of work that relate to that specific project. We also, include any and all of our experience and then company background and all that kind of stuff. And we put it together as a package and submit it, obviously in hopes that they will select us to get shortlisted. And usually they will shortlist about 3 firms to go and interview. And then you go and you interview and you do your best to try to win the project to actually be the final selection. Well, we were fortunate enough to be selected as the architect to do the final project. And the way a project always starts off, especially one of that size, is going through what they call a programming phase, a needs assessment and programming phase. Every client has an idea of what they want to try to achieve, but it's actually in going through and having interviews, in this particular case, with each department, documenting where they're failing in terms of space and where they want to grow in terms of space, and then putting all that together in a package so that the upper echelon, i.e. their town council, can actually get a better understanding of what it is that the city or town needs from a staff perspective. And so once we get all that together, we take that information and then we transform that into actual space square footage calculations, because ultimately, as you are well aware, any project costs money. And the town council is thinking one budget, city staff is just communicating what they think they need. Right? They're not thinking about how much it costs because that's not their role. But more often than not, the town council is extremely optimistic on what they can achieve for a budget that's in their head. And, sometimes it works, but more often than not, it doesn't. And so it's putting that programming and that needs assessment together actually shows them, based on actual staff needs, what they physically need to incorporate into this existing building and grow it in order to achieve not only a better building now, but for 20, 30 years into the future. And so that's always the first step. The second step is then taking those spaces that we noted in the needs assessment and start creating some sort of blocking diagram showing adjacencies of different departments, how they're going to work with each other, who gets next to who, and how effective and efficient you can make their internal operations so that one department who works immediately with another department isn't having to walk all the way across the building, to get to the other department that they need to correspond with, so on and so forth. Then we come up with what's called a schematic design, and we present that to staff first and then to the town council. At Highland Park, like I mentioned, there's 5 council members and each one has their own opinion of what they think needs to happen. And so it's a matter of trying to arrive at a consensus between all 5, which is typical. And once they do reach a consensus, then we can actually move into actual production and turning that schematic concept into actual working drawings so that contractor can actually start pricing it.
Can you explain the difference between what a schematic drawing and a production level drawing might look like?
Yes, so a schematic drawing is basically, in general, it's floor plans and elevations. And it's basically to convey not only the layout of the building, but the exterior aesthetic of the building as well. Once that is bought off on, then going into production, you actually produce significantly more drawings detailing how all that gets constructed and put together. And in this particular case, noting that it was a 1923 building, we actually took the original town hall section. And by the way, for a municipal building, it was stick construction, wood construction, which is very rare today. It had 12-foot floor-to-floor heights, which is, again, very rare because back then they didn't have to worry about infrastructure, ductwork, things like that, that today, we typically have a lot more space to run all that infrastructure. And so we took the whole center section out, which contained 2 basements, and we did a complete center section that was 3 stories on top of a brand new basement that connected the original town hall to the fire station. And so it was quite a complex project to put together and ultimately turned out beautiful. But, part of it was the GC, the contractor, the general contractor who was involved in this project had a significant role at pulling this off, as with most projects being constructed. A lot of times, there's an adversarial relationship between the contractor and the architect, and there's a tendency to point fingers versus let's just get together and resolve it and make sure that the client gets what they want. We were very fortunate because there was a contractor on this project who very much worked like a team player and was wanting to give Highland Park exactly what they wanted. And that's exactly how it turned out. Highland Park was insistent on maintaining that Spanish colonial aesthetic because to them, that was their brand. And they didn't want to lose their brand. And so we worked very hard to make sure that every detail in the building spoke that language, so to speak.
I love that you're talking about brand, because this is one of the things that we've already used in our class and we'll continue to. I was wondering, when you guys, I'm looking at the interior of this town hall and it's gorgeous. Who were the other people that you worked with? And specifically, if you could talk about an interior designer, if you guys used one or if you have one in-house, how do you guys work together?
Yeah, so we, as the architect, have numerous consultants. Inevitably, anytime a building gets built, there's going to be a civil engineer who deals with the site, who deals with infrastructure necessary for the building, utilities, storm drainage, storm sewer, sanitary sewer, all those kinds of things. And for some reason, and I know what it is, nobody wants the site drainage to fail, because ultimately that's one of the worst things that can happen to your building. And so the civil engineer is a very important key role in just getting the site ready for the building. We work with structural engineers. We work with mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineer. It's one team. They're typically called MEP engineers. And then there's always a landscape architect as well, who designs not only the landscape, but the irrigation for that landscape to make sure that it's going to survive. People generally associate landscape as just the plantings, but there's a combination of hardscape and landscape. And in this particular case, if you look at the front of the building, there's quite a bit of hardscape that was incorporated into the landscape, and it served multiple purposes. Highland Park has a fully consolidated police department. What that means is they can serve fire and police. You know, they can swap. You know, one individual can be a fireman, 3 days a week, and then be a policeman the other 4 days a week. And the police is a part of their town hall building. That's where their headquarters is. So that's a consolidated operation. Is typically called the Department of Public Safety. But because they are housed in that building, their building is very close to the adjacent street in front of the building. The last thing they want was someone's ability to drive a car into their building. And so what we came up with was the idea of doing some hardscape planters that were filled with landscaping that would actually prevent a vehicle from getting close to the building. And I thought the landscape architect did a phenomenal job at working with us to come up with a design that looked like it's an integral part of the building.
Yeah, that's a really interesting solution beyond, barriers and
A lot
fences.
of times, if you go to police departments, you'll see the typical barriers out in front protecting the building from vehicles. It's called ramp protection. And in this particular case, obviously, that's not something that Highland Park would go for, because it needs to maintain their brand. And of course, I think the planters did an excellent job at doing that.
It also softens it. It's not as
Oh, yeah.
threatening or
Right.
defensive.
Yeah, absolutely. Behind those planters, though, if you look at the arched windows, those are AR-15 resistant windows.
Wow.
Wow.
And that glass is probably about 1.5 inches thick. And some people think, well, this is Highland Park, what's going to happen? But the chief at the time was just trying to make sure that what was installed would protect everybody in the building.
That's great. And as far as interior, same
Yeah,
thing?
so the interior, so there was one other consultant that was also a key factor in working with us, is because the council didn't have any architects on the council. I would say they didn't feel 100% comfortable that they could look at our drawings and know exactly what we were showing them. And so they wanted us to work with a local, meaning a Highland Park architect, who could actually communicate, be the liaison between them and us. And so, they brought him on just to review our drawings, make any comments, and then add his thoughts to the drawings. And that was also a critical aspect of making sure the town council achieved actually exactly what they wanted, and that there was no miscommunication or misunderstanding on what was being presented to them and what they understood.
And I think that's good for our students to hear, that all these people are not only having to work together, but having to make compromises.
Oh, yeah.
Given that different people's visions and what is affordable and what the needs of the person hiring you have.
Yeah. So in saying that, I will tell you, I mean, and I think I may have mentioned this to you early on, but I would say 95 to 99% of all architects work specifically and only to try to achieve exactly what the client wants to achieve. And then there's that 1% of architects around the world who specifically get hired to speak their language, to display their art. If you think of Frank Gehry as an example, look at all of the museums that he's created now around the world, and it's phenomenal, but he gets hired specifically because they want his architecture to be a piece of art in a statement to that location.
And they don't want another Guggenheim. They want their own
bingo
new original version.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so that 1% is a very difficult place to get as an architect or an artist for that matter. The majority of us, and I say that proudly, we all want those projects that, hey, we could do this and it's a statement, but the reality is the majority of our lives exists and the success of our firm really relies on providing clients what the client wants, you know what I mean? And basically going through that process is helping educate the client to some extent on why and why not certain things may or may not work or what may be better based on our experience. But ultimately, we're really trying to help the client achieve, what they want. It's not necessarily what we want.
Appropriately, I think that could be said for all of the industries that we're covering. I mean, every artist.
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, you mentioned it's about giving the client what they want, but I think that doesn't mean the client is coming to you and saying, this is exactly what I want, so, make this for me. You, I think, have to do a lot of interpreting and analyzing and bringing your own experience to the table to help them realize what it is that they want too, I think.
Oh, absolutely. A good word that I've always used is we translate your ideas into reality, and that's exactly what has to happen. Because, let's face it, they can convey their ideas and thoughts, but we have to take those and transform that into something that pleases them, and that they find appealing and that will ultimately work for them and make their life better. And so, you mentioned that architecture is this art form that people can see through skylines, but as an architect, it's really interesting to me that architecture as art is not only something that you look at, but you can actually interact with. Physically go through the building and find different aspects of that building that are very nicely designed and thought out. And that's the way you really should be experiencing it, as opposed to just looking at it from afar.
I love that. So I'm looking at your website and how it's scrolling through some images, and I like all of these homes and buildings. One with a circular skylight. There's one that overhangs. It's like cantilevered out. There's a firehouse. There's some really great stuff. Is there one of these that you can remember translating what they wanted and them coming to you and saying, well, we kind of want this, and you being able to take one of those elements and saying, here's why we're moving in this direction. Here's why you want this.
Right. So I will tell you, so I think I know which house you're talking about that has a cantilevered upper deck, for lack of a better description. So as you are well aware, Oak Cliff has so many varying styles of residential architecture. And the term mid-century modern, right? Essentially, Frank Lloyd Wright was a mid-century modern architect, but if you look at his buildings, everybody seems to think that, or confuses the term mid-century modern with quasi-contemporary. You know what I mean? They have these planes, and Frank Lloyd Wright did all of that. In the School of Architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright is considered a modern architect. And so that's where it gets a little bit confusing with terminology. Modern architecture started in the 20s. I will send you an image that another architect from France, Le Corbusier, did. And when I first saw it, I was like, okay, that's something that was done recently. And then I learned that it was done in the 20s. And yet, I'm sure a lot of kids who aren't familiar with it, or people in general, might think very much the same thing. Oh, that's a modern building or a contemporary building. And in essence, it's not. It's all part of the study of style and structure to try to move forward. A lot of things in history mandated that construction start changing. The Industrial Revolution started making steel and all those kinds of things, so buildings could actually go higher and things like that. And it's amazing to me, but that particular client, they love mid-century modern. And so some of those elements, like that cantilevered balcony that you see, all sort of reflect the perception of that style. As an architect, I will tell you, and I think it's a fairly common thing among architects, we don't like the word style. Because when people say, well, what style is that? It's architecture. You know what I mean? Why do I have to classify it as a style? Even in housing specifically, like when someone says, well, can I have French country? You know, and you're like, what the hell is French country? You know what I mean? And so you have to start Google, what is French country? And you can Google a million different images that don't look anything alike, and they're called French country. And that's the one part that I think realtors play into, you know, the sell of architecture, you know, and so they'll use, and quite honestly, mid-century modern is used a lot in real estate today because it seems to appeal to people. And it may just be a contemporary house, right? But they'll term it mid-century modern.
Such a broad word that it maybe include everything. So was that client happy?
Oh yeah, they're very happy.
Do you find that architecture is kind of like fashion, where things kind of become very trendy and then they kind of go away and then they come back again?
Well, it's funny because I know some of the municipalities, like for example, I don't know that when you look at Highland Park, it's Spanish colonial, and you know, you can go to Spain and you see that type of architecture. You could go to Morocco and see that type of architecture. You could go to India and see that type of architecture. And how it got the name Spanish colonial, you can research, but the reality is over time, details were borrowed and put together because someone liked them. And then they carried over and they were brought, you know, from one country to another. And somewhere along the line, somebody coined a phrase and, you know, called it something. And so you can look at architectural books for styles, and Spanish colonial is just, you know, it's recognized that way. It's Spanish colonial now. It's funny because when I was in India, I was looking at some of the detail of the arches there. And I was like, certainly this isn't Spanish colonial, but it looks just like it, you know what I mean? And so it was really funny to me to compare and actually learn that it's not necessarily the name, it's a particular detail that people recognize, you know?
So it sounds like it's not multiple styles that are all kind of on their own waves. These waves kind of intersect and crash and
I know.
Form new styles,
Right.
For lack of a better word.
Yeah, exactly. And so what we try to do, I mean, we try our best not to get caught up in a trend. And so what we're always trying to do is, and it's an attempt, but we're always attempting to design something that's not going to look like it doesn't fit anymore and nobody wants it, you know, 10 years from now or 15 years.
Like an office building from the 80s or the 70s.
Yes. I mean, you guys probably recognize some of those office buildings where they were trying something and it looks like a dated old building, you know, and for all intents and purposes, people just have a tendency to want to demolish it, you know, which is also sad. And so we actually appreciate when municipalities come to us and say, well, we want you to design something. And we understand that the word timeless is also overused because it can't be timeless, but it can last and serve them for many years, you know. And so we like it when the municipalities give us this. Well, we want to be able to use this building for 30 years. We want to use it for 50 years. And whether or not they actually do is a different question, but that's their intent when they build it. And so it always makes us happy that we're not having to pick someone's favorite style and say, this is what I want you to design.
You've been great, and we've taken a lot of your time, but I was hoping here at the end, in this class, we talk a little bit about how we can break those parts of different industries into very basic building blocks. For instance, we talk about how many things you can do with line or shapes and spaces, right? And how those can communicate a feeling when someone enters a space. Is there one that you can talk about in your work that you maybe lean on heavily or you think is maybe underrated that has a lot of importance in architecture? And how can you communicate certain things? Can you give us an example of how you might communicate a feeling through one of those basic elements?
Yeah, so I'm not sure this will answer your question, but I know one of the things is, you know, here in Texas, brick is a very common material. It's used all over the places. And I know that if you look at the North DPS facility, one of the things that we tried to achieve is texture. Yes, brick gives you an inherent texture, but you see it everywhere here in Texas. And it's basically the texture of the brick itself. So we wanted to try to communicate or create a texture with it that didn't just say, this is brick. Because, I mean, when you look at just about anything today, even if you look at you could look at a smooth wall, or you could look at a very textured wall, and it gives you a different feeling. It presents a different feeling to you just having the depth of the texture itself. And so on that building, even though it was predominantly brick, we tried to create these horizontal striations and ins and outs so that from a distance, it doesn't feel just like brick. And so I have always felt that there's no such thing as a project for this 98% that has no budget. And so you're always working with a budget. So you're just trying to be creative with what you can use, and then try to create something just a little bit different with that material. And so texture to me is also a very important aspect.
I love, as you're talking about brick, there's a exposed brick wall behind you.
Oh yeah,
That's right.
And this building and this building was also built at the turn of the century. Originally, we've been in here for years, but it was originally called Modern Apartments when it was built. And one of the reasons that we ended up in this space is because of the exposed brick that it had.
Well, thank you, Robert. I hope we didn't take up too much of your time, and I think this is going to be a really valuable experience for our boys.
Thank you all.